I've been working on trying to understand grave sweeping sociologically for like maybe 10 years now. This project comes out of a project on happiness in China. And every year I present a little piece of it at SSSR. And actually last year I presented something and then met Roman, who is now, we wrote this paper together. So kind of fun. You never know who you're sitting next to. It might be a co-author. Joke too. All right, so I am going to talk today about the ritual resolution of grief, how grave sweeping maintains continuing bonds in China. My core message is that communal religion, which grave sweeping is a part of, arranges a long-term process for resolving grief in China. And my argument, or our argument, is that grave sweeping consists of ritual activities that relate to the deceased in a continuing bond in these ways: maintaining the bond, relinquishing the bond, and then adapting the bond. So some theoretical influences on this thinking. I've always loved the essay on the stranger by Georg Simmel, where he argues that in every single social relationship there is both closeness and remoteness. And you can generate closeness or remoteness by interacting. And I think this pertains to grave sweeping because as people are doing stuff, the activities, they're doing something to their relationship with their deceased, grandparent or parent. Second influence is Weber's Social Psychology of World Religions, and actually I don't love that essay as much, but I always loved Protestant ethic and his work on that. Reading it in grad school was like, oh, I love it. Partly because Weber has the argument that religion, or in the case of the Protestant ethic, Calvinism and the idea of predestination brings people anxiety and then makes them do stuff. So I am really interested in how religious activities, ritual activities, make people feel, how it affects their emotions, and maybe they'll do stuff too. And then finally, more recently, I have been reading and interested in this Confucian philosopher, Xunzi, who was writing around 200 BCE. And he has one essay called The Discourse on Ritual, and in it he says, thus, ritual is a means of nurture, which is super interesting. That essay has stuff on a funeral ritual, and how actually when people do these actions, they actually get some kind of psychological adjustment, that these are things that people do, and actually at the end of the actions, they feel better. I think that's pretty interesting because, he argues that these actions can adjust your relationships, a little like a Simmel, of course he came before Simmel. Okay, but it can adjust your relationships and therefore your emotions. So we draw on this literature in psychology on continuing bonds and adaptive bereavement. And this is a body of work that looks at how when someone dies, actually many people around the world, in many ways, maintain sort of this continuing bond, a kind of ongoing connection with the deceased, but that these things have to change. So for example, my mother is my mother. She has passed away, but she'll always be my mother, and I'm not going to have another one, and so over the years this bond changes, but I don't really necessarily just lose that all together and never think of a mother. So this idea is that this adaptive connection with the deceased, it adapts so that the bereaved is no longer preoccupied with the loved one's physical presence, but that the bond sort of continues in some way. And that sort of adaptation includes the process of both relinquishing some aspects of the bond and then also maintaining some of the aspects. So we draw on this field work that was gathered from 2013 to 2019, interviews, ethnography, and then a big national survey. And so basically the argument is this. Grave sweeping maintains, relinquishes, and adapts these continuing bonds. So grave sweeping is a thing that Chinese families, most of them do about once a year, maybe twice. And what they do is they gather and they bring food, they bring like kind of gifts, and then like they kind of talk to the deceased person, like in April or at another time, and then then they leave. So what they're doing is actually, so it starts off like a visit to any elderly relative because you're bringing food. It's like a family meal sort of. You're bringing maybe some money to give, which people do for their elders. You're prepared to kind of chat a little, but and that sort of is accesses or maintains, or it makes them think of like the bond that was in the past, the person that we loved in the past. But at the same time, these actions also relinquish part of the bond. And that's because, well, the things are not done exactly the same way as when they were alive. The food that you bring is not eaten, at least by the deceased, right? You're not really eating together. The corpse cannot spend the money, right, or they use the gifts really in the same way. And then if you talk to them, there's no response, right? So it's sort of like, wow, at the gravesite, that really comes to, like, wow, you really notice that. But then, actually, there's also an adaptation because people kind of do like a slightly different thing. So the food is taken home and eaten. Spirit money, which isn't the same kind of actual currency, but it's money paper that people buy to use, to burn. It's like, oh, here, use this in the afterlife or in the other world. And then, I think this is interesting, there's a slightly different relationship with the deceased because you can update them, like, oh, so-and-so got married, or so-and-so has an exam, but you can also ask for some help, which is now different. You don't ask, like, living people for this kind of help, but you can kind of do that, like, oh, could you help me out with this, with an ancestor. And so these adaptations then bring the role of the deceased to an ancestor and does this to the continuing bond. So here is a video. That is what most people go, though not everyone goes every year. And in our survey, we found that 79% went at least once during the past year. It's now a public holiday as of 2008 because actually everybody was going and like people would skip work and there was like all this like traffic. So they're like, okay, let's just make it a public holiday. And those are some of the things you can buy like to burn, like as gifts to burn for the relative. Okay, so implications and questions. I think the question is, what is the effect of religion on grief? And in this case, this is an interesting, I think, set of activities that this communal religion does, but people do in it, that leads to something, I think, with the processing of grief, with the continuing bonds. Does it add to emotional and psychological well-being? And Roman will talk a little bit about the psychological.
Hi, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is the role of religion and ritual in the psychology of bereavement and grief. And so I think maybe my role here is to sort of locate some of these processes in how people generally, how we understand people to cope with bereavement. So, one piece of the context is this sort of idea that bereavement and coping with loss happens along two tracks simultaneously. It's the two-track model of bereavement. That people are making adjustments in a sort of biopsychosocial domain, right? You're trying to figure out whether you can still afford the house. You're trying to figure out, what the next steps are, whether you're going to find another partner if you lost a spouse, or if you lost a child, how, what's next for you, right? And at the same time, there's an attachment component because, we are a species where attachment is so primary to how we navigate the world, and loss of a loved one disrupts those attachment processes. So you have to figure out a way to deal with that at the same time. And so thinking of religion and ritual, I think that there's lots of ways to think about ritual, and rather than adopting a sort of functionalist lens where these rituals have a specific prescribed function for how people would cope with bereavement, or maybe a structural lens where the ritual takes you through a certain set of paces, maybe thinking of it as affordances, opportunities to engage with the process of bereavement in culturally legible ways that can sort of help you navigate through this process. And for that, I sort of think of we're thinking of the dual process model, which is sort of after the Kubler-Ross stages of grief have sort of gone away. This is sort of the new dominant paradigm in thinking about grief, which is that actually we're constantly fluctuating between coping with the loss of the other and coping with how to deal with what's next. And these stars represent places or affordances where you might actually, denial is a pretty normal part of grief, and you can deny. There's opportunities to deny because you can relate to the lost loved ones, right? Also, focusing on the loss, not denying, right? Maybe even being consumed by it. Well, there's opportunities to do that too, because you can sort of focus on your relationship. And at the same time, you're able to sort of enter and exit this ritual space. And that might present opportunities or affordances for the grief process.
Oh, we're good, actually. You can keep talking.
Oh, that's all.
I was just tapping. Okay. Well, so, right. These are the implications for psychology of grief. This is actually the last implication, which is, okay, well, what's the significance of the numbers around the world for different kinds of ritual, mourning in ways that maybe provide opportunities for grieving? So in All Saints' Day in France, it's a picture there. This is Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, and then you were talking about the Hmong, like there's ancestor worship. And in China, I mean, the numbers are like this. This is from our survey. I did just a back of the envelope, like, calculation that at least 2.9 billion worldwide are very used to these kinds of things. I think the number's higher. But anyway, yeah, what does this mean for understanding, like, psychological well-being and, like, sort of, emotional experiences around the world? So just to recap, argument has been that grave sweeping consists of ritual activities that relate to the deceased in a continuing bond in these ways, maintaining, relinquishing, and adjusting. And then that the core message has been that communal religion arranges a long-term process for resolving grief in China, or provides opportunities for resolving grief in China. Okay, thank you.